You got your phone? Okay, would like to reconvene to public session at 7:06 p.m. And if we would stand and salute the flag in a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. Okay, recommend approving tonight's agenda as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mr. Lee, second.
Second.
Mrs. Pugh, roll call vote, Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler. Approved. And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Approval of the minutes. Approval of the minutes of the Board of Education regular meeting of December the 13th.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh. Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend the approval of the minutes of the Board of Education student disciplinary hearing on January 3rd, 2024.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler. Second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
And Mr. Lee.
Abstain.
Mr. Lee abstained. So approved. Okay, we have no recognition of guests, correct? Right. And let's see, board participation, Mr. Lee.
Well, just Happy New Year, everybody, and thank you for the first half, and close out the second like you did the first, and we're going to be just fine. So thank you for what y'all are doing, and hope you had a good time with your family and friends and got a little rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Pugh.
The same thing. I've said several times sitting right here, this is the best time for education. Christmas to Easter break is when it happens, and I've been in a couple buildings where I've seen teachers carry around bundles of pencils this big because I know they're testing. So keep up the good work. Thank you.
Okay. Mrs. Isler?
Ditto, and ditto.
Right.
Happy New Year to everyone, and I'm just glad that everyone has returned back when the new year came in, and continuing to hear progress being made every day, and that makes me happy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nichols.
Yeah, I went out to school today. I was out here today, and I got to sit in on a history class. And what really impressed me was the fact that history was being taught. It had to do with World War II. In the past, what I've seen was history books that used 3 pages to cover 10 years of the most impressive history in this country. But the teacher was there. It's an AP class. I realize that. And they were talking about the atomic bomb and the building up of that, and the understanding that the kids had and everything else. I hope that what we got there is going to be the norm, not the exception. He's very knowledgeable of history. I was very impressed. Then I went over to the elementary school, ODLES, and I was up there, and I got to meet with the 6th grade team. Everybody's ready to learn. Everybody's ready to teach. I'm just impressed with it. I'm hoping it continues. We'll see how it goes. That's all.
Okay. Welcome back, and would like to thank everyone for the Board of Education members' gift that we received tonight. And
Thank you
gift
all.
card
Thank
that
you
we
very
received.
much.
Thanks to everyone for that.
Yes.
Pay hasn't increased, so we'll take this. We'll take this gift.
But when I was in school, they had a Board of Education, but that was not like this one. It was a bit different. The Board of Education was used to educate you in case you got out of line.
Gotcha. Yeah, we had that board too.
We did too.
Okay, next
The older people know about that.
Next, we have public participation, and first I have Mrs. Angela Cunningham. Okay, Mrs. Cunningham, You can address the board, as you're very well aware, and at the beginning of your presentation, please identify yourself and the purpose of your presentation. Your presentations are limited to 3 minutes, and you shall not bequeath any or remaining time to another speaker. Persons wishing to speak longer must arrange for a place on the board's agenda. Persons wishing to be placed on the agenda shall inform the superintendent of that desire in writing and the topic no later than 3 full working days prior to the day of the regular board meeting, which normally is the third Wednesday of each month. You may offer objective criticism of school operations and programs, but the board will not hear complaints about school personnel or other persons at a public session. Other channels providing for board consideration of complaints involving individuals exist and shall be used. Members of the board are expected to conduct themselves responsibly and with due respect in an effort to maintain a high standard of conduct. The board president will have authority to terminate the remarks of any individual who does not adhere to the above rules. Persons appearing before the board are reminded that although requests may be directed to the board, action and answers to questions must be deferred pending board consideration.
Before I start, I have a question about the policy that you just read.
Okay.
You speak about the standards I'm held to, I understand. And then you speak
About what, excuse
the
me?
standards that the speakers are held to.
Okay.
However, if you go back and watch YouTube videos of the board meetings, and several of those videos, you will see and hear the board members talking amongst themselves, whispering, shuffling papers, and there are actually times you cannot hear the speaker speak because of all the background noise. So I believe that if a speaker is speaking, we deserve the same respect that you're asking us to give you. You know, shuffling papers and whispering. And if you watch the YouTube videos, it's very clear and very apparent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You may begin. Please state your name.
Angela Cunningham. A few months ago, a school employee spoke out about misconceptions being discussed at board meetings. I'm here to clarify that actual facts and evidence are reality, not a misconception. I have spoken out about bullying and physical altercations that occur in this district and the lack of support from leadership. I have several copies of emails that I have in my possession dating 2 years prior to my daughter's incident. And those emails I voiced multiple times about the relentless bullying that my daughter had endured. I also expressed my concern of her attending school and her safety, yet there was no resolution. That is a reality, not a misconception. My daughter has a lifelong injury related to the physical assault that happened in the lunchroom in this very school. That's a reality, not a misconception. Anyone who feels I am spreading misconceptions when I speak, I welcome them to spend a day with me and my daughter, and they can witness firsthand what our reality is. A mother whose child is in the middle school district has sent several emails voicing her concerns about her son's IEP. He is supposed to receive 20 minutes a week of speech therapy. This school year, he has not yet received one session. That mother has not heard from a speech therapist. IEPs are bound by federal law. That's a reality, not a misconception. This is only one example of an IEP that's not being followed in this school district. I have had several parents reach out to me and voice their concerns about the IEPs of their children not being followed correctly. Therefore, I am pursuing my training as an IEP advocate to help those parents. A mother whose child is homebound has emailed the assigned homeroom teacher several times to request a tour of the school. Her son is new to the middle school, and although right now he is homebound, he has never been in the middle school, and he has requested to tour it. But since August, that mother has not yet received one response, and she has, at this time, 12 emails that she has sent to that teacher. I'm not here to talk about baking cupcakes, making friends, or getting applauded. I am here to speak the truth. Those that state everything that is great, they have no idea of the reality of what is really going on. Perhaps those who speak out that things are so great, their kids are free from harm and successful because they have one or more parents teaching at the district. Not every child has that luxury. Instead of wanting to hear the truth and the reality about what has happened in the past and what is continuing to happen as far as IEPs not being followed, children not being safe, policies keep changing to silence those telling the truth. They'd rather someone get up here and say everything is sparkles and glitter and just applaud them, but yet they don't want to hear what's happening to the children.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Cunningham.
Sure. July 24th, we can make the difference. That's when the superintendent position becomes available. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Mrs. Tracy, is it Worthen? Worthen. Okay, Miss Worthen, I'm going to repeat the same policy. You're allowed up to 3 minutes to speak, and you will not be allowed to bequeath any remaining time to another speaker. Persons wishing to speak for a longer period must arrange for a place on the board's agenda. Persons wishing to be placed on the agenda shall inform the superintendent of that desire in writing, and the topic no later than 3 full working days prior to the day of the regular meeting of the board, third Wednesday of the month normally. Speakers may offer objective criticism of school operations and programs, but the board will not hear complaints about school personnel or other persons at a public session. Other channels providing for the board consideration of complaints involving individuals exist and shall be used. Members of the public are expected to conduct themselves responsibly and with due respect in an effort to maintain a high standard of conduct. The board president will have authority to terminate the remarks of any individual who does not adhere to the above rules. Persons appearing before the board are reminded that although requests may be directed to the board, action and answers to questions must be deferred pending board consideration. Please state your name.
My name is Tracy Worthen.
Okay, your time begins.
School students worldwide are expected to adhere to a code of conduct, including showing up on time, paying attention in class, not blurting out in class, and not creating other distractions. School board members should be held to the same standards. However, this is not the case here at the Laurel School District. I personally have observed the following at Laurel School Board meetings. A superintendent blurting out in disagreement with a statement made by a parent, board members tapping pens, shuffling papers, laughing, whispering, making faces while people were speaking at the podium and looking around and not at the speaker. I also observed meetings starting late after the board members casually strolled in and were clearly unconcerned about their lateness. Surely students are expected to be on time and pay attention. School board members and other public servants should be held to high standards both on and off the clock. Board members should be aware that their behaviors at public meetings and while on the clock are directly observed by the public, and in particular, the students and parents that they serve. They should also be aware that how they conduct themselves off the clock is also observed by parents, students, and members of the public. Despite any attempts at discretion, personal affairs and activities of board members eventually make their way to the eyes and ears of the public, and in particular the students. Public servants who do not want their personal affairs made public should either step down from their positions or conduct themselves in a manner that represents the leaders that they are expected to be. Why is it that a concerned parent is ignored, ridiculed when speaking about the safety or lack thereof of the students, and in particular her child who was violently attacked at school? But Laurel School District staff members are recruited to speak at board meetings with opposing opinions to this parent and to attack and criticize this parent's attempts to make the children safer. And why are they applauded for doing so? This activity is not only unprofessional, but also represents a conflict of interest. But why would the public expect any different from this Laurel School District? Address parents' concerns rather than trying to intimidate and shut them up. Implement policies that help to ensure the safety and welfare of students. Conduct yourselves professionally or step down.
Thank you. Okay, next, with reports, financial report. Dr. Laramore would like to
Yeah, Mrs. Horsey, our Director of Finance, is on vacation, well-deserved vacation, and she has supplied the board with the monthly financial report as well as the financial position report. And if you have any questions, we'll make sure we have those answered for you upon her return. But you've had some opportunities to do it. All right?
Does anyone have any questions that you would like Dr. Larimore to
No, I don't.
pass on? We good?
No, ma'am.
Everybody good? Okay, you gotta sign that and give it to her. All right, financial report, the final FY 2024 operating budget. Recommended approval, the final FY 2024 operating budget as submitted.
Second.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols?
Approve.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler? Approved. So approved. February 1st financial position report. Recommend the approval of the February 1st financial position report as submitted.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols?
Approve.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler? Approved. So approved. We have no unfinished business. New business, school choice. We only have one, recommend approval of school choice as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Okay. Fundraisers. Recommend approval of fundraisers as a group.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of fundraisers as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols. Second, was that Mr. Lee? Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler? So approved. No rentals, professional trips. Recommend approval of professional trips as a group.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of professional trips as submitted.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Date of school board election, May 14th. We have one seat vacancy in case anyone would like to file for the school board seat. Items for presentation and review. First reading, policy GBEE, electronic communication and social media policy. Recommend the first reading of policy GBEE, electronic communication and social media policy as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites. This policy will be available for review by the community at the law school district buildings and on the district website. Community input is welcome and should be directed to the superintendent of schools no later than Tuesday, February the 20th, 2024. First reading, new policy GCFB, minimum age requirement policy. Recommend first reading of policy GCFB, minimum age requirement policy as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites. This policy will be available for review by the community at the law school district buildings and on the district website. Community input is welcome and should be directed to the superintendent of schools no later than Tuesday, February the 20th, 2024. First reading, policy GBAA, staff conduct, harassment, or sexual misconduct towards students with addendum A. Recommend the first reading of policy GBAA, staff conduct, harassment, or sexual misconduct towards students with addendum A as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites. This policy will be available to review by the community at the law school district buildings and on the district website. Community input is welcome and should be directed to the superintendent of schools no later than Tuesday, February the 20th, 2024. Possible action on executive session items. Personnel attachment A, professional. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment A.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
And Mr. Lee.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment B, support. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment B.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols. Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
So approved. Attachment C, coaches. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment C.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Regular board meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, February 21st, 2024, 7 p.m. right here in the cafeteria. And motion to adjourn.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler. Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
We adjourn at 7:27. Thank you. Thank you to everyone.